loose and frisky, a feather-brained fellow forced his fond father to fork over the farthings, and flew far to foreign fields and frittered his fortune, feasting fabulously with faithless people. But fleeced by his fellows in folly and facing famine, he was forced to find a job as a feed-flinger on a filthy farm. Fairly famishing, he fain would have filled his frame with the food fragments from foraged fodder. Then he said to himself, "Phooey! My father's flunkies fare far finer than this." And the frazzled fugitive, frankly facing facts, fled forthwith to his family. Falling at his father's feet, he forlornly fumbled, "Father, I've flunked, I've failed, I've fruitlessly forfeited family favor." But the far-sighted father, forestalling, further flinching, furiously flagged down his flunkies to fetch a fatling from the flock, and they fixed a great feast. The fact I want to focus on this morning is the fond father's fervor for his son, the father's love. Fathers sometimes get a bad name in this day and age. And we know that there are some not real good dads out there, not real good fathers. And then we meet some of the fathers that we've seen in this congregation, and we know that there are still many fine fathers around. I've come to believe, as we've looked at this text from Luke chapter 15, that Jesus actually intended to tell this story to us because it's the story of the great Father's love for us as much as he did mean it to be the prodigal son. You know, scholars have discovered over the years that rabbis, prior to Jesus coming and telling this story, oftentimes told a story very similar to this one, but with a very different end. The rabbis would tell the story about the son turning away from his family and leaving and taking his inheritance and basically proclaiming the father to be dead, and then going out and wasting the money, as we know the prodigal did. But Jesus' story is different. For the rabbis and Pharisees, those telling the story before Jesus, always ended up with the prodigal son finding out that there was an end to the father's love. Not so with Jesus. Why did the rabbis tell the story that way? I believe the rabbis told the story with the unhappy, unloving ending because they believed their God was a God of judgment and harshness and of rules. And Jesus came. Jesus came with an entirely different view of God. Jesus' view of God was one that said, put a ring on his finger, put the robe around his shoulders, and let's have a feast. Oh, the rabbis, when they heard Jesus begin to tell this story, they said, now we're going to get good, solid teaching. But when it got to the end, they left disappointed and empty and angry even. Because after all, isn't enough, enough. I believe Jesus told this story this parable because so many people have such a warped view of God. And we have seen that this week in such horrific ways. Edward Robinson once observed, "The world is a spiritual kindergarten where bewildered infants try to spell God with the wrong blocks." Did you ever try to do that? You have blocks and you try to spell words and you get frustrated because you don't have the right vowel or the right ending. Those of you who do words with friends with me and beat the tar out of me most often, you all understand that. If you don't have the right letters, if you don't have the right vowels, if you don't have the right attitude, the right understanding of who God is, can we get any more lost than what our world seemed to be this week? So many see God in this world as a cold and cruel and uncaring deity. They see him as judge, prepared to pass a terrible judgment on them, because that's what they would do if they were God. And dare I say, it might be what we would do if we were God. After all, how long should we let someone tear us apart? How long should we put up with people going off and throwing fits and wasting time and wasting money? How long? How long? But the fact is, that's not the God that Jesus came representing. For God, as Jesus saw him, was a God of redemption and of hope and of new life. God was one standing on the porch, praying and waiting that lost one would come home. Samuel Colgate, the founder of the Colgate business empire, was an amazingly devout Christian. He once told of attending an evangelistic service and noticed that as the invitation was given and people came forward, one of the first people to walk down the aisle was a well-known prostitute. She wept openly as she expressed her desire to become a Christian and to join the church, and there was this dramatic pause in the service. For this was back in a time when churches still voted on whether or not someone could be a new member. It became apparent that these people weren't sure they wanted this woman in their church. Well, that's not a new attitude. That was the attitude of the Pharisees and the rabbis in Jesus' day when it was telling the story of the prodigal son. Do you want that prodigal son, that one that just goes off, really as a part of your church? When the people at the church revival where Colgate was attending quietly refused to accept the repentant prostitute, Colgate stood up and rebuked them, saying, "I guess we blundered when we prayed that the Lord would save sinners tonight. We forgot to specify what kinds of sinners we really wanted to have in our building and in our churches. We'd better ask him to forgive us for this oversight. For the Holy Spirit has touched this woman and made her truly repentant, but the Lord apparently doesn't understand that she's not the type we want to rescue." we better spell out for him just which sinners we had in mind. Almost immediately, the motion was made for the woman to be welcomed with open arms and into membership in the congregation. You see, that church had forgotten that God was a God of forgiveness and of love. Now, I think there's one more thing I think Jesus was trying to correct in the story of the prodigal son or the prodigal father. You see, I think that the prodigal son was suffering from a false view of his relationship to his dad. The prodigal son has left home. He's squandered his inheritance. He's become destitute and hungry and dirty and smelly. I mean, if you hang out with pigs, you smell like pigs. You know, it's really true. If you hang out in pig pens, it smells bad. Now, imagine the person sitting next to you is hanging out in a pig pen. You'd make him sit on the other side of the building, wouldn't you? Or maybe outside, on the curb. The prodigal son, he's starving to death. He's feeding pigs, which is against his religion. He's feeling it. And let me tell you, having fed hogs, if you get to the point where you're ready to eat what the hogs are eating, it's a bad day. He says, I'm going to set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. Now, it sounds good, doesn't it? How many of you think that sounds good and sounds pretty right? You know, I've sinned against Father. I've sinned against God. I've sinned against you, and I'm no longer worthy. And I guarantee you that if you're sitting in this room, you went, you got it. Turn to a neighbor and tell him, you got it. You see, because I know how people think. But you understand that in those 3 sentences, there are 2 truths and 1 falsehood. There are 2 things that are true in that sentence, and there is 1 that is blatantly false. Shall we review? Number 1. First, he said, I've sinned against heaven. That was right. That's true. So, sentence number 1 is true. Primarily, all sin is against God. So, if you leave and you go out and do some sort of sin, you have sinned against God. Second, he confessed to his father. And I've sinned against you. Right again. So number 1, I've sinned against God. True. I've sinned against you. 2 is true. But number 3, look at that third statement. He says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. That may sound good on the surface. It sounds good. It seems like groveling was appropriate here. Right? Let's grovel, I'll grovel a little bit today. But there's a mistake in his thinking. Did you hear what he said? I'm no longer worthy. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. You see, in reality, he was never worthy to be called a son of his father. That's a basic teaching of Scripture. All sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans 8:3-23. How many have sinned? All? How many have sinned? All. Yeah, we hate that because that means us. How many of you have sinned? Oh, good. I'm not here by myself. There's not a single man, a single woman, a single child who has not yet sinned. You, me, every elder, every deacon, every Sunday school teacher, every Bible school student have all fallen short. Thus, none of us deserve or ever will deserve to get to heaven. You can never be good enough. Somebody asked me once, how good do I have to be? I have a friend. I played golf with him. And he really liked me, and I really liked him. He started to come to church, and he saw somebody join, and he came up at the next golf outing and said, I don't get it. Joining your church wasn't anything like the last church I joined. I said, you've been a part of a church? It kind of surprised me. He says, yes, Dave, I'm really not as, I'm not as delinquent as you think I am, which is probably a good thing because I thought he was pretty delinquent. I said, well, tell me about the last time you joined a church. Well, he says, I met with the priest, and they told me how much it was going to cost to join the church. Really? What did I miss? I didn't have that day in seminary. They didn't tell me that when you join the church, I'm supposed to say, oh, and this is going to cost you this much. And quite frankly, he says, yeah, it's based on your salary and income. I said, really, where did you join? And he told me the name of the church, and I happen to know the priest there, and I'm going, I think I'm going to have a talk. But stewardship committee, we might want to keep this in mind for next time. And I think it was really in mind just for special because he actually could afford it. He says, yeah, it cost me $25,000 to join. That solved some of our problems. But it doesn't sound like grace to me. You can never be sinless enough for God to say, hey, you deserve to go to heaven, and you can't buy your way there, and you can't work your way there. So how can we ever be pleasing to God? How will God ever accept us? Think about the father in Jesus' parable. What was he doing? He was standing on the porch, looking out, waiting for his son to come back home. Did he welcome him back because his son hadn't sinned? No, I guarantee you he remembered everything that son did, and I'm pretty sure he was attached to the gossip mongers in the two communities where they lived. He knew everything that his son had done. Maybe just not all the details. It wasn't because the boy was a less sinful sinner than anybody else in the house. So why did the father accept the son back? Because the father loved the child. The father didn't accept the prodigal son back because the son deserved to be accepted. The father accepted the boy back because he loved him. Notice what Jesus tells us in this part of the story in verse 20. He says, while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. From a long ways off, the father saw his son, and he was filled with compassion, and he runs to the boy to welcome him home. Why? Not to tell him what a failure he was, not to tell him how sinful he had become, not to tell him that there's no way God would ever receive him, but only because he loved him. In his book, Capital of the World, Ernest Hemingway told the story about a father in Spain who had a son named Paco. Because of his son's rebellion, Paco and his father became alienated from each other, and they didn't see one another for years. After years of bitterness, the father's anger ended, and he realized his mistake. And so he began to look for Paco with no results. Finally, in desperation, the father placed an ad in the Madrid newspaper, and the ad read, "Paco, all is forgiven. Meet me at the newspaper office at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Love, your father." Now, Paco is a rather common name in Spain. And Hemingway wrote, when the father arrived the next morning, there were 600 young men, all named Paco, waiting and hoping to receive the forgiveness of their father. That, my friend, is the gospel. And all he was waiting for was an invitation to come home. Amen. On this Father Day, I would invite you to consider how much like the Father